To be with you all. So there are moments in our lives when something like fate or destiny has a way of intervening in the most unexpected of ways. During my time at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles, I acquired a number of books off the so-called free book cart. But one of my biggest hauls came from books placed there by our Bible professor, Tzioni Zevid, as he downsized his collection when he retired. The titles I grabbed either looked interesting to me or were the result of some loving pressure placed on me to take as many books as I could by our teacher and librarian, Rabbi Pat Fenton. I can still hear her saying, "Ooh, this is a good one. You should have this in your library." And so it was on that fateful day that I picked up a number of books by a biblical scholar whom I hadn't heard of, but I was assured was excellent by Rabbi Fenton. His name is Richard Elliott Friedman. Friedman has since become one of my favorite commentators and writers on the many facets of the Torah. That day, I picked up his translation and commentary of the 5 books of Moses, which I often consult, and another of his books that had an intriguing title and cover. It was called The Disappearance of God, a Divine Mystery. And the cover featured the image from the masterwork of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo, showing the familiar image of the naked Adam reaching out his finger, but unlike the original, this time there was no God present to reach back. The idea of a disappearing God felt alluring to me in its unorthodoxy. A biblical scholar who deeply believes in the wisdom of the Torah proposing God's disappearance? I was intrigued. And yet, that book sat on my shelf for many years. In LA, then Boston, then here in San Antonio, unread. Probably part of the reason for that was I really didn't have too much time for additional reading during rabbinical school. But I think another reason was that as intrigued as I was just a little bit afraid of what the book might say. Was he going to propose the death of God in a world where God's absence is already so palpable and painful? Perhaps I didn't pick it up sooner because I wasn't sure I was emotionally ready to dive into the murky waters of the subject matter. But for whatever reason, after all that stalling, I finally began reading the book shortly after moving here to San Antonio. Upon digging into it, I found out that the premise is essentially that from Genesis all the way to the Bible's end in the book of Nehemiah, there is an eerily consistent trend of God taking a smaller and smaller role in human affairs. In Genesis, God is walking around in the garden with Adam and Eve. But by the time we reach Nehemiah, there are no public miracles, no major manifestations of God's presence on earth, only the words of the Torah and a reality of divine absence not unlike the one in which we live today. The question for Friedman is not just technically, how can this be the case, but why is this the case? And what does it mean for us? Following this section of his book, he jumps forward very far into the dawn of the 20th century with its global wars, genocides, and suffering, where godliness somehow felt even less present than in the centuries before. But he doesn't stop there. Using both scientific theories on the nature of the universe, as well as their eerie similarities to Kabbalistic ideas about creation, he proposes that there may be good reason to think, from both a scientific and a spiritual perspective, that humans may be moving towards a reunion with God. But as tantalizing as that all sounds, if it isn't obvious, we are not there yet. While the 20th century, and of course, the unimaginable horrors of the Shoah still mark an impossible height of cruelty that has not been topped, this world is still hopelessly broken in our own time. And even if we doubt that our time is somehow more terrible than the centuries preceding it, the nonstop barrage of news, images, videos, and dire predictions from events and issues all over the world causes us to have access to and take in more cruelty and terror than I think any other time in history. It feels as if every day we are confronted with some awful thing that has happened in some far-flung place in the world, or in our own country, or indeed even in our own backyard. How do we actually live with this reality? How do we carry on the work and enjoyment of our lives without being overwhelmed by the pull of such non-stop tragedy? Well, there are a few obvious options. On one extreme, we could simply give in to the pain of this world and completely lose sight of our own lives in the present. On the other extreme, we could ignore the suffering of the world and only live for what's in front of us, refusing to let things beyond our control shake us. Yet from my perspective, neither of those choices is a fully sustainable or indeed a moral one. And so we are confronted with these terrible realities in addition to all the challenges present in our own lives, and somehow we have to strike a balance between those challenges. This feels a little bit like a lose-lose situation. How do we recognize and discover the blessings in our lives and the world while balancing those blessings with the real pain both we and many others feel that people we will never meet experience? Our Torah readings for these days of Rosh Hashanah force us to come face to face with some impossible choices and painful realities. Yesterday we read of the dreadful choice Abraham had to make when Sarah demands he kick out his firstborn son Ishmael and the child's mother Hagar. The text itself draws attention to the pain of this conundrum, saying that Abraham was greatly troubled with this impossible choice between what his wife demands and the good he wants for his child and the handmaiden who bore him. To be forced to make such a choice after celebrating the birth of his second son, Yitzchak, and his first through his actual wife, Sarah, must have felt like whiplash. All the joy of the moment suddenly transformed to pain and uncertainty. Then, in today's Torah reading, we read about the ultimate impossible choice Abraham faces, whether or not he will heed God to sacrifice his beloved son or refuse God's command to save him. Interestingly, in this second episode, Abraham is no longer mentioned as being troubled by God's command. This time the text leaves us feeling that Abraham perhaps somewhat stoically follows God's instruction without protest. Now, if we take these stories back to our options for how we cope with the troubles of today's world, Abraham's behavior can be seen on that paradigm of extremes. On the one, Abraham encounters terrible news with distress. Even though it is only mentioned briefly, the Torah's mentioning it all shows us that this was something that really ate at Abraham. That one line is enough to help us listeners conjure up painful hours of contemplation and uncertainty about what to do in this situation. This reminds us of the ways that when things get rough, we just want to curl up in a ball and give up. On the other hand, Abraham's lack of response to the terrible command of God in the Akedah points us to the other option mentioned, to ignore the suffering in this world and that which we might inflict on others, and just go about our tasks without excessive worry. Abraham was indeed present when he was commanded in this sacrifice, which we see through his response to God of Hineni, here I am. hinting that he was perhaps ready and willing to obey and did not allow himself to be excessively distressed by it. Should we deeply feel the pain of life in the world or deny the pain we experience and see? These moments are also notable that in spite of God's palpable presence in both episodes, this does not in fact fully calm our ancestors' distress. If anything, in the Akedah and in some part of the Hagar story, God's presence and command causes the distress. God is the one demanding Abraham sacrifice his long-awaited son. God is approving Sarah's possibly cruel plan of casting out Hagar and Ishmael. Maybe it's better that God stays out of an active role in our day-to-day affairs in our time. Maybe humans and the divine simply cannot get along. Maybe God gives us the space to live so God won't make our lives any harder than they already are. And yet, as religious people, we still persist in longing for a connection with the divine in our own lives. We feel God's presence in moments of prayer, in major celebrations, in life cycles, and indeed in times of suffering. But for most of us, these moments are fleeting. They give us a sense of something powerful and beautiful and awe-inspiring when we feel them, but they do not last. God does not talk to us as God did to Abraham or Sarah or Moses. God no longer breaks the laws of nature to stop tyranny or violence or terrorism or car crashes. God is there for us in some ways, but we still long for the public miracles of redemption we read about. Our Torah readings for this holiday complicate this ideal picture, showing the ways that God's intervention is not always a panacea. The awareness of God can, of course, enhance and stimulate our lives, but as any observant Jew knows, it also deeply complicates our lives, at times causing stress and anxiety. And yet, even when God makes matters more distressing, in each of our readings, God ultimately offers overt and subtle consolation. In the case of Hagar and Ishmael's banishment, even as God instructs Abraham to follow Sarah's plan to kick them out, God does not abandon Hagar and Ishmael. Right at the point of potential tragedy, where Hagar can't even look at her child as he dies from starvation and thirst in the desert, an angel appears offering not just a well of water, but also the promise of future blessings. In the binding of Isaac, just as Abraham raises his hand to kill his son, an angel steps in to stop him, offering him blessings for his willingness to follow God to the edge of his parental and moral instincts. And God doesn't just promise blessings to Abraham. At the end of our reading, Abraham hears the news that his brother has had children, amongst them a daughter named Rivka, Yitzchak's future wife. In this seemingly unrelated note, we see how God planted the seed of consolation for Yitzchak as well, who must have been traumatized the most from this episode. And this future relationship of Isaac and Rebekah would not just be one of convenience, but one that takes human relationships to the next level, as it would be the first time that someone is said to love their spouse in the Torah. Now, why do I mention this? Because while God complicates our lives sometimes feels absent or even cruel in allowing terror and strife to dominate this world, God also offers us the solution. God often plants the seeds of redemption in the ground of suffering. God is absent in some ways, but deeply present in other ways. So, Rabbi, you may be asking, how do we experience these seeds of hope in a bleak landscape? To answer that question, we might do well to look to our liturgy for the high holidays. And no prayer expresses our anxiety and fear of the uncertainty and terror of life like Unitana Tokef. Who by fire? Who by water? Who by starvation? Who by thirst? Who by earthquake? And who by sword? But in the conclusion of our prayer, we are offered not exactly a remedy, but a kind of consolation. Teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah, ma'avirin et roa hagzera. Teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah transform the evil of the decree. The late Rabbi Alan Liu, in his high holiday masterpiece, This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, which I highly recommend, notes that the language in this line is about how this big three of actions transforms the worst of life's evils. But it does not remove the evil completely. This is in direct contrast to the source text for this prayer, which comes from the Jerusalem Talmud. There, the text speaks of annulling the evil of the decree. Our prayer, as we have it today, made its own transformation of the language to reflect our lived experience. No amount of tzedakah, teshuvah, or tefillah by us as Jews can end all the suffering and disaster in the world or even in our lives. We cannot annul the evil of the decree. What God gives us is the opportunity to think beyond ourselves and support others' suffering, tzedakah, the space to cry out and praise the divine and envision a better world, tefillah, and finally a process to make a change in ourselves more in line with our personal and divine mission, teshuvah. These are the things that are in our hands. They are not a recipe for taking away our suffering in this new year. They are an opportunity to arm ourselves with loving kindness, with spiritual connection, and with the chance to be better every day of our lives. Sometimes that's all we have in our power to do. Sometimes that's enough, even when it doesn't feel like it. And while this recipe seems very human, very based in our human experience of life, it is actually in these actions that we bring God into the world. In a beautiful summation of this idea, the Kotzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, was once asked by his students, "Where is God to be found?" His answer was, "Wherever you let God in." We not only let God in, but we bring godliness into a world that desperately needs it when we engage in teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah. And of course, it still won't be enough to stop all the terror and pain of our lives. We are not God. We are not in control of everything. But we are God's agents, and our actions can lead others and ourselves to feel closer to the divine. So at the conclusion of the book, The Disappearance of God, Friedman proposes the possibility of a divine human reunion in our future. Just as there was a big bang that created the universe and pushed all the matter further and further away from the source of everything, so too some scientists theorize a corresponding big crunch, where the universe will actually compress back into its infinitely compact source. And while that possibility is mind-blowing and enticing, personally, I'm not willing to wait that long. I believe the divine human reunion can come at any moment we let God in. In any moment, we think outside of ourselves and act for others. In any moment, we cry out for God's help and guidance. In any moment when we recognize the wrongness of our path and commit to real transformation of ourselves, our societies, and the world. In those moments, there is God. As our ancestor Jacob said upon waking from his first encounter with God in the dream of the ladder, "Truly, God was in this place, and I didn't know." But it does not take God coming to you in a dream to experience and realize this. What it takes is the awareness that when we do these holy and mundane actions, we become the agents and partners of God. And God in turn shows up for us in our minds, in our hearts, in our spirits. Now, this may not be the same experience that we always imagined of a biblical God stepping in miraculously and stopping all suffering. But this is the experience that we have. As we increase these acts of goodness in the world, we can increase the awareness and feeling of God's presence in our world. We can be reunited with God in a more mature and complex way than even our ancestors experienced. Then we will be able to sense those subtle, unexpected divine gifts of comfort in a different way than Yishmael and Hagar or Avraham and Yitzchak felt after their lowest moments. They may not come with an angel or a speech of blessings. They may look like our fellow human being reaching out to us to lend a hand, or a moment of song or prayer that takes our breath away. Or they may look like us, striving to make a difficult but necessary change in our life. May this be the year where we finally let God in. May we feel increasing moments of divine human reunion as we continue the work of teshuvah, introspection, tefillah, crying out to God, and tzedakah, justice for our communities and for the world. May we not give up on God, even when things feel hopeless. May we not give up on ourselves to fix a world that is broken. If we do that, then we may find that truly God was in this place all along, and we didn't know it. Shana Tova u'Mitzukah.